righty. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us this morning here for this webinar. The webinar is titled Getting Your Diversity and Inclusion Program Off the Ground, Bringing HR and Legal Terms Together, or Teams Together. This is sponsored by the Salt Lake Chamber's Diversity Council, which I'm a part of. My name is Shawn Newell. I'm one of the council chairs or co-chairs and vice president of business development for Industrial Supply Company here in Salt Lake City. The Salt Lake Chamber has partnered with 650 Technologies to assemble today's panel of lawyers and diversity leaders with experience turning good intentions into results. During the webinar, our speakers will lead a conversation about how companies can get their diversity and inclusion programs off the ground while complying with the law. So I'm really thrilled to introduce and let you know that we're being joined by Neelam, who is the CEO and founder of Shift SLC, and Marie Kulbeth, who is the COO and General Counsel of 650, and Maria Tamburri, who is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Employee Engagement for Dominion Energy, and she's visiting us from across the country. We also have with us today Troy Williams of Equality Utah. So based on what you see here as far as our presenters and members of the panel, it should be a wonderful session that we have today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A function. We will do our best to answer your questions as they come up and to be able to grab as many questions as possible. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Salt Lake Chamber's website after we've completed here. So now enough of me, and I want to make sure that we get into our guest and our presentation. So please enjoy this webinar and make sure you got your pen and pencils with you, gather as much information as you can because it's going to be very informative. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Troy. We're going to get our slides up on the screen share really fast here. And Neelam's going to get us started. We're going to do a very short presentation and then move into Q&A. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in that Q&A. We'll get to them when we get to the Q&A portion, or maybe if it's relevant to something on one of the slides. But we'll be really quick there.
Thank you, Marie. So I'll wait for the slides, but the first thing we'll do is we'll kind of get into terminology. The acronym DEIB, I'm sure you all have heard of it: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Some folks don't even know what those things mean, and sometimes those things get conflated as one whole thing. Each individual letter is different. They have different terminologies. So in fact, and let me just go ahead and jump into just describing what those are. So diversity is all aspects of human difference, social identities and social group differences. This includes, but not limited to, race, ethnicity, religion, color, sex, gender identity, sexual identity, socioeconomic status, language, national origin, disability, military veteran status, the whole gamut of how identities can be very different. It's very nuanced. The way I think about diversity is I think about representation. So when you think about really enacting strategy around diversity in an organization, you're literally just thinking about representation within an organization with these various identities. Equity, on the other hand, is sort of this fair and just practices and policies. Here we go, we got it up. That ensure that all community and all employees can thrive. So equity is very different from equality. Folks get those two confused or mixed up or think that they're exactly the same. But equality is sort of implies that we need to treat everyone as if their experiences are exactly the same. But equity differentiates that from that and says we need to make sure that we provide access and resources based off of everyone's different, unique situation or experience. And then inclusion is establishing an environment where employees of all backgrounds can thrive, no matter their identity or background. And then belonging is taking it one step further and saying, let's create an environment in which every single person can feel welcome, where they can feel like their full selves, and without the fear of being judged or scrutinized or ostracized within an organization. So those are the difference between diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And so belonging is sort of new. It's a new acronym that's sort of been tacked on to sort of DEI. I would say in the past 5-6 years, where it's become really popular to say DEIB. Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry, Neelam. I was just going to say, with that thought about belonging, something that happened in the news this week that really had me thinking about belonging specifically was, I'm not a hockey fan, but I happened to see a news story about Luke Prokop, who's the first openly gay NHL player. He just signed with the Nashville team. And the thing that he said when he was being interviewed about this, he basically said, you know, from a young age, I have dreamed of being an NHL player, and I believe living my authentic life will allow me to bring my whole self to the rink. And I just thought, you know, that's the idea of belonging, right? He can bring his whole self with him. And that's what we want for everybody when we talk about, you know, DEIB.
Yeah, exactly. Where you don't have to alter any part of you or leave any part of your identity at the door to fit this sort of norm that society sort of has set for you, that status quo norm. Okay, so the next slide, please. So why is DEIB important? Why does it matter? I would say that DEIB is both essential to the business. I'm sure you all have heard about the business case, but more importantly, it's important to the culture of the organization. If you want to create that culture of belonging, you're going to be focusing heavily on all of those components of DEIB in your organization. So let's quickly talk about the business aspect, which I do believe that we are no longer having the conversation and making the business case at this moment in time, where we're making the business case of why this is important, because I feel like generally most organization and most organizational leaders understand why this is important. I think it's now moving from the why to the how. And I feel like that's kind of where everyone is at. But let's cover why it's important for those who are not entirely sure. So Glassdoor did a study where they interviewed the workforce and sort of what they are looking for in terms of jobs and job applications. And 64% of candidates say that diversity and inclusion is a factor in accepting a job offer, meaning that the diversity and inclusion is something that is part of the core values of the organization. It is very much part of the business of the organization. And that is what gets people motivated to want to be align with that particular organization. 55% within the organizations think there is a policy that promotes diversity and inclusion. Ethnically diverse leadership teams are 36% more likely to be more profitable. That's a McKinsey report. I believe that's a 2020 report. And then companies with diverse boards see more profitability, 43% more likely to experience higher profit. Again, McKinsey. Another report was released shortly after the murder and death of George Floyd, called the Edelman's Trust Barometer. And what they did is, and they look at brands and they look at consumers and sort of the how consumers align with brands. And they found that 60% of the respondents indicated that they will either boycott or buy based on a brand's response to protesting and racial justice ideologies. 60% also believe that a brand should publicly speak out on systemic racism and specific attacks on Black Americans. And most of these are Gen Zs and millennials. And these are the generations that are more likely to align with brands that take on social obligations and have a stance in some of these social political issues. So if you think about the future of our workforce, you are talking to our Gen Zs or millennials. So it's really important to think about the future of your organization and the growth of your organization. So that's why it's important. But it's also important to the culture of the organization. Everyone comes in with their unique identities, unique perspectives. Those identities and perspectives need to be respected. An organization needs to be culturally competent to make sure that they are producing products that then reflect the clients that they're producing products for. And so it's really important to center diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging in the work that you do in the organization, but also to incorporate that with your cultural values. Okay, next slide. So what are the challenges and barriers? So I'm a consultant. My work is working with and partnering with organizations across the US. And I've met tons of leaders, executive leaders, CEOs of different organizations. And the number one thing that comes up is fear in terms of challenges and barriers. And most of these are leaders. They're afraid of the unknown, of not knowing what they don't know. They're afraid of making mistakes. They're afraid of being judged. They're afraid of getting called out or misstepping or are unintentionally harming, causing more harm. So some folks don't even touch it. They don't even want to engage in conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion because of that fear. The next part of it is, and fear sort of brings on this lack of awareness and understanding. So if you don't want to touch it, you don't want to have anything to do with it, you're kind of worried about what may come of it, you sort of live in this oblivious state. I worked with several organizations where leaders, CEOs don't believe that there's even an issue in their organization, or may not want to uncover some of those issues if they've seen it. And so this type of arrogance or lack of awareness results in an organization that is constantly reactive rather than proactive. And then when something does bubble up to the surface, which we saw last year, summer, after when this large conversation about racial equity, a lot of these organizations were jolted into conversations around race and racism without having that being a prior part of their culture or prior part of any type of conversation. And so they're jolted into these conversations because they never had it before. And that's where most of the mistakes happen. So this lack of awareness gets for folks and organizations to consistently react. And then the next one is common misconceptions. And there's a lot around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some folks feel like DEIB is nice to have, but can be a distraction. We have a business to run, especially I've seen this with startup companies that they're just focused on growing their organization, their business. They're focused on revenue rather than thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion. They don't have time, they don't have resources, whatever it may be. But it's sort of this, extracurricular, if anything. So they kind of fail to see how it is important to the business. There's also this misconception that DEIB is political or has a political agenda, which can be very harmful because you lose sight of the individuals that are deeply impacted in these spaces. And that could potentially benefit from a diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So folks kind of get caught up in the politicized narrative and rhetoric around DEIB and then tend to not deal with it at all, or very little is done within an organization. And then some folks believe that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging is not my problem. It seems like it only impacts those who are not straight, white, male, cisgender. And so when you think about that misconception, and if you think about the most influential folks in the nation, 85% of our Fortune 500 CEOs are white, straight, male, cisgender folks. And if they can be part of dismantling and creating spaces for justice and for equity, that's where we can begin to see the problems being solved. And then the last thing is buy-ins. Leaders truly must believe in this work. There needs to be a personal relationship to this work. and commitment, and therefore that will then manifest in the business commitment. If those things, if there isn't buy-in from the top, then this work is not authentic and it ends up being more performative. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass the mic over to Marie to take us through more sets of slides.
Thanks, Neelam. And I'm guessing all of the panelists are having the same reaction I am, where I want to talk about every one of those just in depth, just about that. But I'm holding myself back. So if we can progress to the next slide here. One thing that I did want us to make sure we're keeping in mind today is that we're talking about all of this from the perspective of companies that have endured and are still enduring a pandemic. And the pandemic has had a big impact on DEIB, and the way it's impacted your business may be unique in some ways because of your industry. It may be more indicative of what we've seen sort of across the board in Utah and in the United States at large. But I do want us to keep that in mind as we have our discussion today. So I just pulled a couple of Utah specific statistics. The first one comes from the Utah Department of Workforce Services, which shows the change in employment in Utah. This is 2019 to 2020. So, the big bulk of the pandemic we saw, in terms of hard numbers, not percentages, we've seen 8,000 fewer women, and 8,000 women lose jobs, 4,000 men. So right there, right now, we see, okay, there's a gender difference in how the pandemic has impacted our workforces. We've also seen a difference across racial and ethnic lines. So if you look at the second chart here, the blue line is for racial and ethnic minorities in Utah, and the orange line is for the white non-Hispanic group in Utah in terms of income from April of 2019 through March of 2020. And you can see like it really impacted everybody, but the larger experience of income loss was for minority groups in Utah. And so, we just need to keep in mind as we're working with our workforce, even if maybe our workforce didn't see this happen specifically, their families did, the people that are in their network and their community did. And so it may be impacting, your employees who stayed on, it may be impacting the people that you're interviewing to bring on. And there's a lot of concerns, as you look at, who are we interviewing to potentially bring on? What are some of the issues that our current employees are facing that could impact their ability to stay with the company? The pandemic has had a big impact, and it may have impacted different parts of your workforce disparately. So we need to keep that in mind. Next slide. And then, so Neelam talked a lot about barriers, and I added sort of the pandemic barrier. And we just sort of wanted to make sure we spend time today talking about how to overcome those barriers so that you can get your DEI program off of the ground. And one of the big ones, I think, is the fear of exacerbating a problem or politicization within the organization. And from the legal perspective, I see a lot of that because companies are afraid that if they bring in something, if they survey and find out information, they're now liable for what they know. And so they may have made a problem worse because now maybe they have some legal liability. There's also the concern that if you bring these topics up, it's somehow politicized, and then you have to deal with a workforce who, it may be that you had tensions that weren't recognized, but now they're recognized and they're coming up more often in the workplace because the conversations are happening. So all of that sort of works together with the sphere of investigation and litigation. And really what we want to talk about today is, what we can do to help companies address that from, a very planned way. What you need is unified messaging coming from the top and being, shared with groups, but then also being lived. And so, I've seen companies where, the messaging is there, they have the statements on their website, they talk about DEI, but then the lived experience of the employees is so different. How do we do that? And a lot of it is with resources and buy-in. So if you make resources available within your organization for DEI programming, if you make somebody accountable within your organization to oversee and implement programs and projects, and to also help understand specifically what's going on in your workforce that could impact what those plans and projects need to be. Because DEIB, it's not a check the box and you're finished process. It's a lived process, and there's always going to be more growth as your organization grows, as your employment base grows and changes. The problems may change over time. You may fix some problems and recognize new ones that maybe weren't top level problems, but once you fix some of those bigger problems, you can start to fix the smaller ones, or vice versa. It really depends on what kind of resources you're able to get and put into it. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today will really touch on that. Next slide. So we do sort of want to talk about today, like what are some of the resources you can go to, what are some of the options we can offer you and suggestions we can make. So first off, right here in Utah, we have a lot of industry groups. Those include everything from, if you're a lawyer like I am, there's the Utah Center for Legal Inclusion. If you're a CPA, the Utah Association of CPAs has a DEI committee that's doing work in education in this space, the Economic Development Corporation of Utah. And then of course we have the Salt Lake Chamber. Shawn is here representing their DEI committee today, and they're working with Equality Utah, who Troy is here representing. So we have a lot of local resources. Neelam is with Shift SLC, which she founded herself. I don't know if we mentioned at the beginning in her previous, well, before she founded Shift, she was over DEIB for Zions Bank Corporation. So she's got the big organizational experience, as well as she's consulted with small organizations, so she's seen it all. And then we also have here at SixFifty, we have a toolkit where we do assessment, and the assessment leads to sort of like, here are the action items we recommend that include, like, these are legal concerns that might be associated with this action item. So it sort of helps you get the feel for things from that legal DEI perspective as well. So those are just a few examples, but there's more than that. There's, you're probably representing a number of additional industries I didn't touch on, but at large, there's more and more resources available as, we recognize as, a business community, how important DEIB is to our growth. So we want to make sure you're aware of those, and we can help you find additional resources if you're having a hard time finding resources that fit for you. Sort of with that, we are going to move into the Q&A portion. This is the end of the slide deck, so we can close that so you can focus on our panelists here. And I think I'll turn the time back over to Shawn to help moderate through the Q&A.
Wonderful. That was a lot of great information, and even myself, I've got questions, even though I work in this space on a regular basis. I'm going to direct this first question to you, Marie. You mentioned the pandemic and how it is still existing. Can you go into some greater detail about the impacts that the pandemic has had on DE&I, aside from the stats that you shared with us?
Sure, and I'll also, if any other panelists want to chime in on this, I'd welcome that. Some of the things that we've seen is that we're seeing greater stresses in certain communities during the pandemic because they've been impacted differently. One example is that, the health side of the pandemic. Some communities, particularly minority communities, have experienced greater health impacts. And so that's impacting their work, obviously, their ability to work. We're also seeing a lot of additional stressors for women. A lot of those are related to childcare. They're taking on a larger portion of the childcare during the pandemic. Daycare's closed, schools closed, they went remote. So even if your workforce was working remote, they were at home with their children. And that impact men as well. But we've seen the reports and the statistics are showing a greater impact on women. More women have left the workforce because of that than men, because of those conflicting responsibilities. We just had a summit for Utah recently about this, specifically in women in the workforce. So, childcare has been a big one, with changes in what's available and, the timing of childcare. And there's gaps as everybody's gone back to work. There's gaps because people have left that workforce. We've lost child caregivers. So that's been a big part of it as well. And so I think we could probably all talk about multiple communities that we've seen suffer different, and in some cases, larger impacts from the pandemic. But I think a lot of them are health driven. So stress, well-being, a lot of them are family-based, depending on if people have dependents. whether they be children or people with health risks that they're the caregivers of. Those are some of the big ones that I have seen. And so I guess just from the DEIB perspective, which I should tie in, those are things we need to think about when we make our plans, right? If we have COVID policies and procedures in place, are they requiring people to start coming back to work? Is everybody equally able to do that right now? If we are requiring it, there's still concerns, with vaccination. Some communities can't be vaccinated. Other communities feel very unsafe if they have to come into a workplace where people aren't vaccinated. So there's a lot of conflicting needs and concerns that we have to take into account with our policies.
Do any of our other panelists have any insights here on this question?
I'd add that also there's been an uptick on anti-Asian hate, just stemming from the pandemic in the workplace, in forms of harassment, discrimination, both subtle and overt types of discrimination. Stop AAPI Hate Center, a nonprofit that tracks incident of hate, reported that 35% of these incidents of violence and harassment actually happened in the workplace, that's huge. And so, and that's been a very big uptick. We haven't even really had in the past had real sort of distinct conversations about AAPI discrimination and hate up until recently, especially in the workplace. And now you're seeing a lot of organizations address this specific type of hate and discrimination in the workplace. And some organizations are coming up with policies that may not hold up in court. Marie, you may have to supplement that in sort of your lens, but policies that say we don't tolerate this type of hate, more specifically towards our Asian Americans and Pacific Islander employees and communities within our workplace setting. And that's very explicit.
Yeah, I think from a policy perspective, banning all hate speech is a very safe thing to do. If you go content specific, you just need to show that you're using examples, and you're not obviously not identifying every type of hate speech out there, because then you get into a different set of problems. But banning it, giving examples of what qualifies can be very helpful, because I think a lot of times people think, oh, if it's mean to me, it's hate speech, right? So helping people understand what hate speech is and how we can combat it, I think can be really important.
I want to thank both of you for that soft guidance into this next question I have. We're talking about people here, right? And HR and so forth, and how to introduce DE&I into your entities. How is it going to be that we can convey this message of the importance of DE&I without getting into some of the foundational and systemic issues that create burdens for our society on all sides when we talk about having these types of conversations? And also, in implementing policies and things that are considering the different traumas and the different experiences of individuals. How can we do this in a way that's palatable for those that are in positions of leadership to be able to help guide their teams into a greater understanding of the importance of this space?
What a great question. I would actually love, I don't know, Maria, if you might want to talk about this from the actual perspective of you're implementing programs at a large national organization. So I feel like your experience here would be so helpful.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a great question. I think for us at Dominion Energy, our commitment to D&I is it's the right thing to do. And it's tied to our company values of ethics and One Dominion Energy, which is our the way that we define teamwork. I think it is really important as you start working towards implementing a D&I program is that one, again, like I said, for us, we tie it to a company value. You tie it to what your company is really about. I think the other thing that's really vital is that the approach needs to be inclusive. That as you implement the program, You get buy-in from all your leadership, your mid-level managers, and your employees. You also have, it is also important to incorporate education and vehicles of communications where your teams and your leadership can have conversations about how to interact and how to really talk about DE&I in a respectful way, because that is really key to be able to have that inclusive approach. The other thing that we have, and we're very proud of, we have employee resource groups, and these employee groups are really wonderful to really give employees an opportunity to be able to talk, to unite, to have those shared common values and goals, and really be able to share their own experiences. And we encourage all employees to join them. I'm a Hispanic American, and we have one of our ERGs is OLA, which is representative of our Latino communities, and we encourage everyone to join that ERG to really learn about the culture and learn about the fact of Hispanic Americans throughout our company, but also the nation. Additional to that, obviously, workforce representation is incredibly important. Hiring diverse talent, making sure that you have a good representation, doing those efforts, working on hiring. We at Dominion Energy make sure that we have diverse talent in every one of our pools for every time that we have a job out. And here in Utah and in our West, we've done an incredible effort to really be able to increase our diversity in the Dominion Energy West business. And lastly, I think we do this because we want to be, as a company, representative of the communities that we serve. It is really important that as a company, we're representative of our communities, and that our employees and the communities see that we have a variety and a diverse workforce to be able to represent the company.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Trey, because I was going to point to you right away.
I sensed it. Yeah, so I was so fortunate when I graduated from college. My first adult job was at KRCL Radio, 90.9 FM. And I didn't know what a unique, special place this was at the time. But my boss, the station manager, was Donna Land Maldonado, who's a Native American woman, the only Native American woman to run a non-Native station in the entire country. She became my mentor. My immediate supervisor was Tongan. My coworkers were Native American, Black American, women. And I just thought this was how the world was. So the whole mission of KRCL was to provide platforms for underrepresented communities here in Utah. And so that really, I think that really embedded within me how important this was. And I didn't know, it felt almost utopian in a manner, because I just thought everyone always everybody was like this in all these different companies in Utah. And then I realized quickly that was not the case. So it is such a powerful, beautiful thing when people are sharing a common mission together from diverse perspectives and diverse points of view. And the things that we can accomplish together by bringing people together from diverse backgrounds is phenomenal, and it's incredible. So I'm really grateful for that sort of training that I got at KRCL. And so I move a lot of that into the work that I do now at Equality Utah, which, when we focus, we are an advocacy organization for the LGBTQ plus community. We lobby up on Capitol Hill to ensure that the laws in our state include and protect our community. But then we also certify Utah companies as business equality leaders. And I'm very proud to say that Dominion Energy, you are certified as business equality leaders here in Utah. And we provide fun, interactive training that meets people where they are. That's really important thing that everyone's in a different space here. And we don't want to just talk down to people, and we don't want to be, too prescriptive. We don't want to be too condescending. We want to sort of lift everybody up, because we know that there are cultural barriers to embracing LGBTQ people in this state. So we approach the topic by identifying shared values, by building on common ground. And when we approach the topic of DEI through mutual respect and empathy, we find that people are more open to receiving our message. And so we provide executive coaching to both the C-suites and to ERGs. We train people on the language of inclusion, the gender spectrum, EEOC compliance, and then also how to build a diverse and retain a diverse workforce. So for us, it's really about building bridges. Harvey Milk, who was one of our great sort of leaders in our community, he said that if we're going to live in harmony, we've got to learn how to build bridges from community to community. And especially we got to figure out how to build bridges to communities where there are all these ideological differences, where people might even be a little bit suspicious of us. And then if we are able to sort of approach each other with open hearts, identifying shared values, then we see that these barriers start to relax and then dissipate and then collapse. And then we can really start to connect human to human. And that's the kind of work that we're really invested in with our organization. And we're really excited that so many Utah companies are coming to us saying, hey, can you help us out here? And yes, we are here to serve.
I kind of want to follow up on both of those. I think they really answer a couple of the questions that came in the chat about, like, how do you get that buy-in? How do you overcome fears about, politicization or, resistance to DEI? And I think that shared values piece is so important. Because when you talk about it as us, them, it's not a way to get buy-in, right? It's like, okay, we need to train our workforce to be more inclusive of other people. And it's like, it makes it feel like it's not something that's already going on in your workforce. You don't know what's going on in your workforce unless, and even if you have surveyed your workforce, there's probably still a lot that you're not aware of if you're not having these conversations, if they're not open, and if they're not inclusive. So I can promise you that, right? But this is a great way, like thinking about the shared values piece. One of the things that organizations do, not all organizations, is you can survey your workforce. You can find out what's the makeup of my workforce like. You can do it anonymously to help protect you from some of the legal issues of asking questions like, what's your sexual orientation, what's your racial or ethnic background. Those are sensitive questions, but you can do it anonymously so you can gather the overall data to give you an idea of what's happening. But you can also ask questions that are really specific to your industry. And that might help you identify some of the underlying values and principles that are the ones you can talk about easily to help move into the ones that might be harder. I know, like by way of example, the legal industry, which I'm a part of, in addition to all the problems we have with representation of women, representation of racial and ethnic groups, representation within the LGBTQ community, in addition to all those issues, right, we also have an issue with elitism. It's like, oh, did you go to one of these schools? If you didn't go to one of these schools and it's a very small group, your opinion isn't going to be as valid because your education, isn't up to par. And so, when we talk about DEIB, we also talk about that elitism question, like, are we treating some of our members of the organization differently because of, what might really be sort of code for a socioeconomic background issue, right? So you can find out like what other things other than I'll say the obvious things, right? The ones we always sort of bring up, what other things might be code for some of the problems in your organization that you could then start to say, okay, there's some values here that we need to talk about. We need to, figure out what our values are as an organization so that our employees can share in those values. So I think value discussion is hugely important. Surveys can be really helpful to help you identify issues that are existing or that, might be future issues, right? It's like, oh, like we don't have much representation. So the issue is that we don't have representation, not that we have people from these different groups and they're being treated poorly. So we're still at the diversity piece. We're not to equity yet, because there's no equity if there's no one there to buy in to have equity. So I sort of think of DEIB as sort of the cradle to grave of the employment cycle. Somebody asked, about diversity, and it's like, well, diversity is getting representation within your workforce. Then we talk about equity, inclusion, and belonging within the workforce. So there problem may be that you haven't built diversity. Start there.
Yeah.
But
Mary,
create a place for equity and inclusion. Yeah, Maria.
No, I'm so sorry. I wanted to jump in because something that you said actually triggered a thought, so I apologize. One of the things that I think it's really important is to also incorporate some sort of training, but a training that is also that you're able to share experiences, that you're able to have an open dialogue around the training. I know this year we're implementing, and we've been doing a training around diversity and inclusion for some time. And one of the things that we've talked about this year is around allyship and how we can become allies and bring awareness to those microaggressions and things that people just do, but they don't really realize that they're doing. And so raising that awareness and having those conversations, and obviously this year we're doing it virtual due to the fact of COVID. But I think those conversations, even though the training is virtual, have been incredibly insightful for a lot of our leaders, and being able to have a discussion and to recognize, like, I wasn't aware of that. And you think through that and you're like, oh, next time I'm really gonna, stop and think a little bit before I say, say something that might hurt someone's feelings or that might be perceived as inappropriate. So I do think implementing some sort of training into the DE&I program is really important, because there are just some things that people just don't realize that they do, and it's incredibly helpful to have that education.
And one thing I would add too, with both Maria, and Troy, this idea of training and education. Luckily, as a consultant, I can just come in and I can, the first thing I do is I assess what the level of awareness is within an organization to understand what type of training and what type of education and what type of development does this workforce actually need. There was a question here that said, oh, maybe it went away. It's talking about how this work is highly politicized, with a leader having fear that it's too political. There's a level of understanding how aware is this leader? What misconceptions do they have around diversity, equity, inclusion? What exactly is that fear, and how can we demystify some of those perceptions around DEIB? And what you'll find, so I do this in a range where, I identify who are the detractors of the organization, so the folks who are like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And then there are the advocates of the organization. And then there are folks in between this sort of spectrum. And what I do is I try to identify where folks are at in this sort of, I guess, spectrum. And the folks that are the detractors, which is a very small percentage, and usually in most organizations, I don't spend time with them. and they're not always the influential folks. They're not always the ones that are making the major decisions, but they are there. What I do find is that majority of the organization are sort of in this middle ground where they have the fear or they have a misunderstanding what this work is about, or they want to do the right thing, but just don't know how, and they don't know how to move along this to turn into allies or to be advocates. And then from there, I ask, okay, what exactly do you think you know about this? What is the perception around this topic? And then you can kind of build out the training or the educational programming for that. But really hitting it right on the head is really important, because sometimes you can bring in a training on microaggressions and folks are like, what the heck is a microaggression anyway? Like, I don't even know what DEIB even stands for. You know, you kind of want to, as Troy said, meet folks where they're at. You truly do want to meet folks where they're at. But I wouldn't mess around and I wouldn't spend any time on the detractors, on the folks that are like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is not my thing. This is, you know, that are blatantly racist or homophobic or sexist or whatever that may be. Those are not the folks you want to spend your energy on. And if that happens to be your leader, your CEO, leave the organization. Don't be in that organization. It's that clear and simple, because it's really tough to try to get someone who's completely against this work to change. That takes a lot of emotional and human capital to do so. I would spend time with the folks who are in the middle, which is going to be majority of folks.
I so agree with you, Neelam. That is so true. There are factions in our culture that are invested in division. They want us to have contempt for each other. And that could be, partisan cable news. It could be our social media algorithms that are sort of amping us up against each other. But really, truly, there is nothing more American than DEI. And now, because we know that as a country, we do have a history of inequity. We have a dark legacy of Jim Crow and a history of denying voting rights to women and people of color. And of course, there was a time until, just a decade ago where LGBTQ intimacy was a criminal act. So, but what's great and beautiful about the United States of America is that we strive for a more perfect union. We are a work in progress. We see inequality. We see injustice, and then we see movements arise to challenge the status quo and to inspire us to become better than we have been. And that's what I see DEI doing, challenging us to become better than who we have been. And so I'm very optimistic. I'm very hopeful. And as I see where we are as a country right now, it is alarming on many ways, and it is frightening in some capacities, but it's also exciting because there are so many people saying the status quo is not just, and I want to be part of the solution. And that's what I think is the critical key here. If we come in with DEI training, and I've seen this done, people weaponize DEI training to shame people of privilege, to shame people and make you feel like you're responsible for all the oppression that ever was. That's not the right approach. We're not all responsible for the oppression, but we are responsible for being part of the solution. We all have a part to play to break down the barriers that keep people from rising up. And DEI work in your workspace can be part of creating that more perfect union that our founders dreamed about.
I love that, just because you're speaking my language, making it the more perfect union, but the idea that, we're all supposed to be part of the solution, in a business organization, I think that's actually a really easy proposition to sell. You come into an organization, it's like, I don't care who created the problem, we have to fix it, because this is our business, this is our organization. So, whether it was the sales team or the marketing team or the people in engineering, however it started, we have a problem, team, let's get together, let's solve it. Let's solve it creatively. Your teams know how to do this, right? They know how to work together to solve problems. They're just used to focusing on one specific type of problem. But, organize them, implement them as teams. And I think that's like a really important key. Like Neelam was talking about, like speaking to the middle. Most people are really open to this. They don't know how to do it. I've been taking training with the Utah foster care system, and they have, just last night, they were having us go through these scripts where it's like, okay, this is how you talk to a child who's experienced trauma, who you're trying to teach a new behavior, right? And so there's this connection piece where you have to connect with them, you explain the rule, and then you offer choices. And I mean, it seems really basic, but they have us practice it. And like, we're practicing it and, we're all grown-ups in the room and we're sitting here stumbling and like, oh, but what if then they choose the thing I don't want them to choose? How do we handle that? but it's practice. And that's what these trainings need to be about. If you're bringing in trainings to your company, you're giving a safe space where people can practice, where they can get the script of how to talk around these really difficult issues that have been politicized, but how to depoliticize and focus on values, how to focus on the team and the community, because your organization is a community. And we're talking about building that community. And I think that's really the value that helps people come together to approach DEI at the organization, at the business approach. We have a lot of larger community issues to solve, but within your organization, you have some control. And you have power from choosing who's part of your organization, who's going to stay at your organization, who's going to lead, and use that power for good. Okay, that sounds kind of cheesy, but you can do that. Like, every organization has values. Choose what your values are going to be.
I see DE and I and B, I just learned about B today, being an umbrella for communication. So when we consider the communication and the bridging, I want to have you as a panel speak to language. Speak to the importance of the correct language, speak to the importance of considerations of language when we think about the legal ramifications of the language we use when implementing these initiatives. And, I want you to be very open when we're discussing this, because language is critical. Maria mentioned microaggressions. We mentioned the fear that can be developed through some of the language that we use that creates barriers. And I just want to have you have a free for all on this before we run out of time, because this is really important. It's the language, the way that we convey the message is critical to our success in this space. Anyone?
We're all being really polite.
Yes, well,
Right, go ahead, because you had mentioned that you do inclusive language training.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on this. I think this is something that I'm very sensitive to, because sometimes we go to the universities and the academies and we get all these sort of theoretical concepts and terms that we think are really cool, and then we go and start talking to people who live out in suburbs or in rural parts of the state, and talk about elitism. They think that you're talking in this completely different language. What is this cisgender, heteronormative, blah 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 blah? And sometimes it just it activates the amygdala often in the brain. And so people go into this fight or flight response. They either want to challenge you, like, are you trying to make me, speak differently, talk differently, or they just resist and move away from you completely. And so I want to make sure that we actually talk to people in their language. I mean, I go up to the Capitol and work with Republican lawmakers, and I find that, if I start using a bunch of academic terms, they like push me away. But when I start talking in the language of conservatives, and there's a lot of them here, I find that all of a sudden they start to relax around me. So I talk a lot about, in the context of LGBT issues, about freedom and liberty and about the desire for us to achieve the American dream. And when I start talking in that language, I find that people who are more conservative start to relax and start talking like, yeah, that's how I feel. And so I find that's really important for us, not to be condescending in our terminology and in our language, but to actually find where people are and go there sort of rhetorically with them. And then you can start to sort of move people with you. And so that they're not shutting off from the experience. We don't want people shutting down. We want people opening up. And language is critical in that process.
Hi, this is Maria, and Troy, I agree 100% with you. I think it would be counterproductive to instill fear in people about, language. I mean, I think education is important. I think it's to really meet people where they are, and also realize that, sometimes, an individual might just make a mistake, but as long as you have open dialogue, or you make sure that you create an environment where people can speak to each other honestly, respectfully, I think that is the type of environment that you want to achieve, knowing that there's always going to be circumstances where If a person says something, that made someone a little bit uncomfortable, that you can actually have the discussion afterwards. What you said wasn't really, made me feel this way. And then you can have that interaction, and it's going to be something that, will be respectful. And I think if you can achieve that, that is the place where you want to be.
And the thing I would add too is, I mean, how many of us here as practitioners have made mistakes? I mean, we talk about language, and I made several mistakes. The interesting thing about language and diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, it changes every damn day. Like, I can't keep up with that either, but it's my responsibility to keep up with it. And it's everybody else's responsibility. Google these words. But it's not about being politically correct or saying the right things. It's just being open, to Maria's point, to being open to being kind of called out if you make a mistake, but not called out to the sense of you're canceled as a person because you made that mistake or you said the wrong thing, but being called out and really understanding that what I said may have caused harm. And if it's caused harm, I want to correct my behavior, and I want to make sure I don't continue causing that harm. I think people forget that part. They kind of get to the point where they feel mortified, they center themselves, it's all about them. I usually say get over yourself as much as you can, because it's about the work and it's about the harm that you're causing just by saying a particular thing, because words are very powerful, and it's the way that we communicate. So it's one big powerful way that we do communicate using words. So it only benefits you to know how to say something where it doesn't cause harm. And I think just putting it in that simple context, people are like, oh yeah, wait, that makes sense. It's not about me walking on eggshells. It's about me making sure that I'm not hurting folks.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of low threat ways we can do it too, where people can learn the language but through the policies and things that we implement as an organization. And those are low threat. So it's like, when we draft job descriptions, right? Put somebody in charge of reviewing those for inclusive language. Make sure that you don't say, you're looking for a salesman, you're looking for a salesperson, right? Like, that's really simple. And it's an easy way to say, oh, look, we're going to change this word here. And because we want to make sure that, everyone feels like they can apply for this job, right? We want to increase the pool of candidates. So that's like a really low threat way that, somebody who's been trained, whether it's somebody from HR, or if you have somebody like me from legal, whoever in your organization's been trained can be designated to help with the hiring process. So, make sure that our job descriptions are inclusive. Then we're going to do a yearly website review, or a, biannual, however often, website review, where we make sure that, we're reading through and we're checking every web page and we're saying, like, are we using inclusive language here? And are we, providing it in a format that's accessible to all groups? Those are like low threat ways to help teach your workforce what they need to be thinking about with their words, because it's not their words, it's the company's words. We're going to review the company's words. We're going to make sure the company is speaking appropriately. And that signals to the workforce, this is what we need to be doing as individuals as well.
Boy, we could be here for a long time, a couple of hours, and I appreciate all of our panelists for being here today. We're really short on time. So I want to thank SixFifty for their partnership, as well as everyone else joining us here today. And remember, this webinar was sponsored by the Salt Lake Chamber's Diversity Council. And if you want more information and to get involved with the Salt Lake Chamber, visit us at slcchamber.com. And again, thank you everybody for being here today, being open and being willing to learn. And we're going to continue these conversations through the Diversity Council here at the Chamber. And we want everybody to continue to participate and be involved. So again, if you have any questions, please contact us. And I appreciate so much our panelists and the expertise that they were able to provide today. And everyone have a great rest of your week. And we're clear.